Last week we looked at the missing of the Great War, those who had no known grave. And in our latest Trench Chat we're joined by historian John Broom, who has a book on this subject coming out in October. Welcome to another Trench Chat on the Old Front Line. I'm really pleased this week to be joined by John Broom, a Sheffield-based military historian and writer who's got a book coming out on the missing of the Great War. John, can you tell us a bit about how you got interested in the First World War and where your research for this book began?
Well, my interest in this particular area, Paul, started probably 7 years ago on a trip down to Dorset. And the wife and I drew up outside a church, as we frequently do, to look at the war memorial. And on that war memorial were listed 10 names. And I noted that 3 of them had the same surname. So I did a little bit of internet research and found they were brothers. And another one of the names listed on there was a brother-in-law. So after further digging around, I found out that 2 of those brothers had been lost during the Great War and their bodies never recovered. I managed to find a book that had been published in 1920, a book of remembrance about the whole family, the surname Pope. The father, the patriarch of the family, was a major brewer in Dorchester. He was a justice of the peace and owned various large tracts of land around the town. And he'd commissioned one of his own sons-in-law, a vicar, to write a book of remembrance and a book of admiration for all the contributions that his 10 sons, 3 daughters and 3 sons-in-law had made to the Great War. And I managed to track down a descendant of Alfred Pope who had in his possession a vast archive of letters that Alfred had written and his wife Elizabeth had written, trying to find out the whereabouts of their son, Lieutenant Percy Paris Pope, who'd been lost at the Battle of Loos. Dozens of letters sent to relatives of other men who'd been lost that day, men who'd been taken prisoner of war, and men who'd been invalided back to the UK injured. So that sort of started a fascination with the anguish that families put themselves through, not knowing the fate of their sons, their husbands, their loved ones. So I was fortunate enough then to get a commission from Pen and Sword Publishers to write a book about the missing of the First World War. And the book that you mentioned, which is coming out at the end of next month, really focuses on 8 particular families whose the remains of their sons and husbands were never found for 100 years, and who had to undergo the torment and the lack of closure that would bring.
And the First World War in many respects was unique like that, wasn't it? Because so many men just completely disappeared, often with no witnesses as to their fate.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the Red Cross and Order of St. John put in much work going around sort of military hospitals in the UK, in the Near East and on near the Western Front, interviewing sort of wounded men who might have had memories of where the missing chap, his final moments, what might have happened to him. But that again caused issues, because there's some examples in the Australian Red Cross where the information sent to the families was considered too graphic, and one particular mother complained to the Australian government about the wording of the information she'd been sent. So the volunteers trying to find this information had to tread a very careful line between assuring the family that absolutely their loved one was dead and that they could then move on to the next stage of grieving, without saying, yes, I was standing next to him as his head was blown to bits and parts of his brain covered my uniform. So it was an experience that around half of those who lost relatives in the Great War had to go through. Still to this day, around half those who were killed in the British and Commonwealth armies in the war have unknown graves.
And I suppose there was they were torn between wanting to know what had happened and not wanting to know what had happened, down to that fine detail, like you say.
Indeed, and one sort of pattern that emerged from the stories I researched was the better connected the family, the more anguish they put themselves through. For example, one of the characters in the book is Lieutenant John Butt, an army doctor. He just qualified as a doctor and was commissioned in the Royal Army Medical Corps, as his father had been. His father had sort of stood down in the previous decade, having reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. So Lieutenant Butt, who went missing early on in the war in October of 1914, his father and mother were able to, well, they knew Alfred Keogh, the Director General of Medical Services, personally, so they wrote to him for his assistance. They wrote to the King of Spain to see if the Spanish ambassador in Germany could follow up any leads, as well as, you know, the normal tranche of ex-comrades of their son. And this search went on for nearly 2 years before absolute proof convinced Lieutenant Butt's mother that he was dead. She went through torment, and one of the really tragic things is, I think it broke her health. She died shortly before the war ended in 1918, so she never lived to see, want a better word, the successful outcome of her son's sacrifice.
No, that's right. And many of these families, they did hope beyond hope, didn't they? They hope was such an important thing to them.
It was, there is one of the letters that one of the family put at that very phrase: "I'm hoping against hope that some news may be found." In the case of the Popes, again, a very well-connected family with Alfred Pope being a Justice of the Peace. Again, they wrote to the King of Spain. They also formed, it seems to me, what we might call solidarity networks, because there were a number of families with young men from the same battalion who got missing the same day in similar circumstances, and they tried to comfort each other. And it was a horrible situation, knowing that if one person had been seen to be taken by the Germans, you'd want it to be your son, but all having great sympathy with the other families who that might be. Sometimes families got unsolicited letters. Another character in the book is a man called Ernest Blackburn, who was in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. He was a school teacher. He'd risen his way up to the pupil teacher system in the early 1900s. So he's a school teacher in Leeds, and he went missing later, once at the Battle of the Somme. And his wife received an unsolicited letter from a lady in Scarborough called Lily Dawes, whose husband was also in the King's Royal Rifle Corps, had also gone missing. And she just seemed to want to vent her spleen about the military authorities hiding information, about how she hoped to never see those 4 words again, King's Royal Rifle Corps. So as well as her own sort of anguish and grief, Annie Blackburn, Ernest Blackburn's wife, also had to sort of deal with somebody else offloading onto her. Incidentally, at the same time, Annie Blackburn also gave birth to her second son somewhat prematurely, who fortunately survived, but he died tragically young. So this poor lady lost her husband in the First World War, her second son just after the end of the Second World War as well. So tragic lives.
And I think in working class communities, I mean, we know a lot about some of the wealthier families that had missing sons from books like the one that you describe, memorial books. But when you sort of look at newspaper reports from that period, you see, Mrs. Smith from a back street in Sheffield asking about her missing son at Sayre. It was just as prevalent there, but we perhaps don't have so many records of it.
I think, no, not so many records, but you mentioned Sheffield, and when some of the wounded from the Sheffield City Battalion came back, from after the attack on Sayre on the first day of the Somme, that they again were bombarded with requests, demands, anguished pleas for information, as they themselves were recovering from the horrors of the Battle of the Somme, their own wounds, both physical and psychological. So yeah, it wasn't just a case if you were sort of working class or from an ordinary sort of family in Sheffield, there was no access to information. You still had your channels of inquiry to go down. It was you just perhaps had less of a range and the of people to contact, and the search would perhaps go on for a shorter amount of time before you ran into a dead end.
And I think sometimes you see their grief as well, the working class grief expressed not in memorial volumes, but on headstones in civil cemeteries across Britain, where it's a family grave and it remembers a son killed at Lewes or on the Somme. And when you look them up, they're almost always missing soldiers. That was their place where they chose to commemorate them.
That's right. I mean, there's just along the way for me here, there's a cemetery in the town I live in Penistone, and that has quite a few of those examples where names were added to family gravestones, but the men, have looked up on memorials to the missing over in the Western Front battlefields. And you mentioned memorialisation. This again took many layers. I felt very privileged that some of the main characters featured in the book, we know about them because families kept letters, reports from the Red Cross and Order of St. John, as a sort of memorial archive within the family, and they've sat within the family, being lovingly passed down through the generations, through 100 years. And for the first time, many of these stories are seeing the light of day, and it's been a real honour and quite humbling to share with the families, their experience, and the thanks from them to say that it's so nice that great Uncle Alan's sacrifice his life is going to be permanently commemorated. So there's that layer of commemoration. There's obviously the war memorials established in most towns, villages, cities up and down the country. I mean, for most of these men, you can find them commemorated 8 or 9 different places. For example, Ernest Blackburn, the Leeds school teacher, he'd grown up in Dewsbury, so his name's on the wonderful memorial in Crowness Park in Dewsbury. His name is on the memorial in Armley Park in Leeds. He's obviously on the Teakwell memorial to the missing. A lovely story was that his son, Stanley, the one who survived and eventually became an academic at the University of Leeds and donated his papers to that university, the Leeds Education Committee commissioned a memorial plaque for the men who'd been, the Leeds school teachers who'd fallen in the war. And when the committee moved buildings in the 1980s, this plaque was lost. And he tracked it down and found it in a basement of the new building.
Oh, wow.
And one of the final acts of his life was to have it reinstalled in a new building. So, his father is commemorated in the place he grew up, the place they lived, Armley, the place where he worked, where his headquarters were. Those so many places, but there isn't an actual defined place where that family can go and pay their respects.
I think it was all part of that grief process, wasn't it? I mean, I think it demonstrates really clearly the power and the strength and the depth of the grief that was there at the time of the First World War.
It's a depth and the breadth, because it continues to this day. For example, another character in the book, Rifleman Alan Stirling, again of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, he was from Wolverhampton, and on this centenary anniversary in 2014, along a particular street, silhouettes were made of every man from that street who had gone to war and never come home. And his relative was able to stand next to that memorial of him with his name, with his army number, his date of death, sort of commemorating that way. But, obviously she's gone to the battlefields where he fell and tried to get as close as she could to his place of death. But as it was in the sort of retreat in the face of Operation Michael, it could be over a space of a number of miles. So, that sense of loss, that lack of closure, still feeds through to many of these families today.
And I think it was that lack of closure that, even a decade after the war, when monuments like the Menin Gate were unveiled, people were still hoping, weren't they?
Oh yes, not one of the main characters in the book, but Angus MacNaughton, his wife, sort of a decade afterwards, was still conducting searches, and as you said, hoping against hope that there might be some news of her husband. And then conversely, three of the characters in the book, after 100 years, closure was finally made for the families. One particular young man, Lieutenant Gilbert Donnelly, 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers, he again went missing. It was reported missing during Operation Michael, and for a century, the family never knew what had happened to him, and memories grew dim. And then with the sort of advent of the anniversary commemorations, a great nephew of his, Dan Donnelly, decided with other members of the family that it was time to try and find out what had happened. And fortuitously, on the Great War Forum, another researcher had established the fact that there were only 2 lieutenants of the Royal Munster Fusiliers who could possibly be buried in that particular cemetery at St Emily. And using internet researches, looking at the unit war diaries, etc., they finally had it confirmed by the Ministry of Defence that what was previously an unknown lieutenant of the Royal Munster Fusiliers was their great uncle Gilbert. 2 years ago, there was a very moving sort of rededication ceremony. Similarly, with Lieutenant Butt, the process was gone through, and they found out that a particular grave of an unknown lieutenant of the Royal Army Medical Corps in the Hoover Crater Cemetery was Lieutenant Butt, and similarly they were able to achieve that closure, and that was incredibly powerful for those families to, so on behalf of their ancestors, to have that sense of closure. In fact, Lieutenant Donnelly's great nephew was handed the Union flag that would have been handed to his grandfather, so his great grandfather had.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it just shows that the story of the Great War, that last page of its history, will never be turned, will it?
It will not. No, I mean, say there's 3 families have managed to find some closure. Who's to say? Because bodies are being uncovered all the time still, with advances in DNA technology, etc. Yeah, it will never be closed. Those families who have been, in a way, fortunate enough to achieve that closure of having a defined place to visit and commemorate will still carry those memories and treasure the lives that those young men had. And I'm sure that the search will continue for the ones that are yet to be found. And in a way, the establishment of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Westminster Abbey was an attempt at the end of the war to try and provide that place for families, because in theory, that young soldier in Westminster Abbey could be Private Charles Atwood of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, a young man who went out from Somerset, who was lost in the first gas attack at Ypres in 1915. It could be Private Arthur Greensmith, the young Sheffield mining engineering student lost on the first day of the Battle of Somme. It could be Rifleman Alan Sterling. It could be Rifleman Ernest Blackburn, or it could be Lieutenant Percy Pope. So in a way, families do have a place that to commemorate, and many places locally and on the battlefields, but the absolute closure is still not there for them.
No. And when you write a book like this, you must become very connected to these men and their stories.
You do. You end up going to every place that they're associated with. Each of them, I've been to the towns they grew up in. Obviously, the war memorials. Many of them came from religious backgrounds, as many people were in that era. Been to the churches they worshipped in, were baptized in. Where there's memorial plaques to them. And yeah, you end up sort of trying to live in that time of that milieu, that environment, their cultural expectations and upbringing, the religious element, which is often overlooked as a factor in how people mediated the experience of both world wars of the 20th century. And you do get drawn into their lives, into their experience, and I've tried to divide the book into where there's a chapter on describing each individual's upbringing and background and family background, and these were just ordinary people from different classes of society making the way: warehouseman, doctor, printer, a barrister, a school teacher, a medical student, all had lives to lead and contributions to make to society. And unfortunately, society at the time demanded a different sacrifice, a different contribution for them, the ultimate sacrifice. And it's one that still sort of stings 100 years later in families. It doesn't go away, as you say.
No, and I think it gives us an insight into the values of a society more than a century ago, which are in many ways very different to our own, just as I suppose society 100 years before the Great War would have been. But I remember one of the veterans saying to me that duty was important to us. You know, duty was our byword, and it's something that I think many people today struggle to understand.
Well, in particular, the aspects of duty to one's country, which, you know, in the current situation with COVID, we're being exhorted to all do our bit. And also the way that message was mediated through the churches. Again, I keep coming back to this, but what was being said from the pulpits, what was being said by the bishops and the archbishops of Canterbury and York really hit home. And it was an important factor in reassuring men that they were doing the right thing for God, King and country. And the God bit was extremely important. It wasn't just an extra word put in for the sake of it. So yeah, there was so many push and pull factors on these young men, that the pull factor of doing your bit, of being part of what your generation was about, part of doing your duty to your God, your duty to your king and country. In fact, looking at Lieutenant Donnelly, he was actually from a Northern Irish Belfast Catholic family. So he actually put on his application to join any unit Irish preferred. He wanted to particularly be in one of the 2 Irish divisions. And what was sort of really sad was after the war, because of the aftermath of the Easter Rising and the troubles in Ireland, the sacrifice of the Irish Catholic community was really overlooked and downplayed, and it allowed the sacrifice of the Ulster division, Protestant divisions, to be sort of used as a political tool in the Irish conflict. And it became that one group of men's sacrifice got venerated and utilised maybe for aims that they hadn't signed up for, whereas the contribution of another community, until the centenary really came around, was pretty much overlooked, apart from within the private memories of families and in the memorial columns of Irish newspapers.
Yeah, I think during the centenary, as you say, a new generation of people in Ireland, particularly Southern Ireland, are beginning to see that this sacrifice was important. It was a defining moment in their country's history, and that these men, rather than be forgotten, should be remembered.
It sort of seemed to start around the time of the sort of Irish peace process, that the Irish Peace Park was established. But yeah, I visited Dublin in about 2010, to run a marathon, incidentally, but there was very much no sense of war commemoration there. But when I went back in 2015 and visited Glasnevin Cemetery, it was very apparent that commemoration of the First World War, it perhaps Ireland had reached a different place in its history and its understanding of its own past, and it was willing to bring in commemoration, memorialisation and recognition of what ordinary people in extraordinary situation had to do and had to go through. And the focus was more on the stories and the sacrifices and the complexities of the cultural backgrounds of the individuals, rather than the broad political narratives of nationalism and unionism and Protestantism and Catholicism.
Yeah, and I think that generation in Ireland, they were missing soldiers of a different kind, really, that whether they had a grave or not, they were missing from the story, and that's not the case now. I mean, the stories in your book are very, very strong, and I've had the privilege of reading it because you very kindly asked me to write a foreword for it. And it really, that the history of the Great War just weaves through it. It must have been a remarkable book for you to write, really. It
was, as I say, it was for me, the dividing memory, the privilege of meeting or corresponding with, the descendants of these men, and being able to share not just the original, the primary information from 100 years ago, but their thoughts, feelings and reflections on it. As you say, it's a chapter that will never be closed, but I hope what the book does is add another chapter to the ongoing story of what these families have been going through for the past 100 years or more.
Well, thank you, John. And your book, Reported Missing in the Great War, comes out in October, I believe.
It is, yes, published by Pen and Sword.
So I'll put a link on the podcast website to that. I'll also put a link to you on Twitter so people can follow you and get more information on some of the stories and your book coming out. Thanks for this chat. It's been fascinating to talk about this incredible subject, really, that, like you say, is not just in the past. It still has its echoes today.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate you having me on and all the kind encouragement you've given me during the project.
My pleasure. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe to us via your favourite podcast service. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore, and the podcast has its own Twitter feed now at OldFrontLinePod. And have a look at the podcast websites oldfrontline.co.uk. Until we meet again, along the Old Front Line.